Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. In last week's episode, we talked about compassion fatigue. I described in detail a call I went to that I found particularly disturbing because of the event that happened in the wee early morning hours in Pemberton, BC. A vehicle had struck a horse in the morning hours and left it in the ditch until the following morning with a broken spine. The injuries were so severe that that horse had to be put down. And as such, I was the one that was called to go and do this, to finish off that job. I talk about in detail why my compassion fatigue set in at that point and what it looked like, why I started to have this hatred towards others. Even as I reflect on that moment of compassion fatigue, I also start to look at the points of maybe I stopped actually trusting people too at that point, after seeing what they were capable of doing to this poor animal and leaving it. Now, the very real aspect of policing is that you see this bottom 1% of the population who just continuously makes poor decision after poor decision, and we get called in to clean up the mess. It's not actually an accurate picture of what makes up society. So despite us going to these difficult calls over and over and over again for our careers, there still is a lot of good in this world. As you can tell in my voice, I have a bit of a cold right now. You don't have to worry about catching COVID, though, through the podcast. You'll be okay. But I did want to take an opportunity this week to switch gears and shift a little bit into a little bit more of a positive conversation. On the heels of that thought, I thought I would share a story with you that I reflect on as probably a highlight of my career, one of those calls that you get, that you will only get once in your career. So join me as I tell you about the story of the time that a friend and I had to go and spike belt a car. And then I subsequently ended up getting in a foot chase with a man with one leg. I was working a night shift with a friend. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning in Whistler. And this was about three to 4 years into my career at that point. And as my partner and I sat in the office at 3 in the morning, we both had a moment after typing where we both just looked at each other from our computers as we were touching up our files and getting things ready for Crown Counsel. And it just hit us. We were bored. We were so bored. I don't know why that night we were bored, but we were incredibly bored. So as my partner looks at me and says, "You know what? I'm so tired of this place. Nothing ever exciting happens here." And it did. But by that point, we most likely had become adrenaline junkies and were so used to constantly having adrenaline coursing through our bodies that any time we had downtime, we were bored. So as my buddy and I, we start going back and forth about, what could happen in Whistler that would be so cool, right? What would be this big call that we're both sitting there waiting for to happen possibly. And the radio goes off and we can hear this car in the background with the engine completely pinned. The roar of the engine over the mic was so loud that I actually couldn't hear the voice at first that was actually on the mic calling for help. And we both looked at each other thinking, there's nobody else working in Whistler right now. It's just my buddy and I. That's it. I had wondered in that moment if an outside agency had suddenly been thrust in and dispatched to us on our channel so we could get live updates from them. During a break in one of those radio transmissions where we couldn't exactly tell what was going on, a dispatcher had jumped on and just let us know that they had sent Squamish's dispatch channel 2 hours, and we were now listening to them, and they were currently chasing a vehicle that had just been used in a bunch of different break-ins. My buddy and I were just talking about how bored we were, and now all of a sudden this vehicle that might have been stolen, that was just used in a rash of break-and-enters in Squamish, was being chased up to Whistler, to us. As dispatch continued to advise us as to where they were, how fast they were going, and all of the details of the chase, they asked us to get a spike belt and head south to intercept this pursuit. So in that moment, we stood straight up filled with adrenaline once more, ready to go. The only problem was we didn't know where the spike belt was. We were both sprinting around the office like chickens with our heads cut off, looking everywhere, under desks, on top of closets, in behind doors. Everywhere that we could possibly look, we did. We honestly had no idea where this spike belt was, and this was not an option. We were going to find this because we wanted to stop this pursuit. This was a once-in-a-lifetime call. Now, because it was so late in the evening, our sergeant's door was closed and locked. And at the end of searching, when we couldn't find the spike belt, we both said we might actually have to kick this guy's door in to his office to get the spike belt. I said, hold on, let's check a few cars outside. I think I saw a spike belt in one of these cars. As we were searching the rear of all of these different police vehicles, we finally located one spike belt, and that was all we needed. My buddy shouted, "I got it, let's go." So he ran back over to me, to my police car, and we jumped into it, and we took off like a shot. We had our lights and sirens on in the car as we sped down the highway down towards where we thought we would intercept this vehicle. My partner had called the supervisor and woke him up and said, "Hey, I know you just went home and your shift ended. We're out. We're looking for a stolen car here, possibly that had just been used in a break and enter. You may want to throw your uniform on and come back out. We're headed south." A mere 10 minutes later, as my buddy and I got to a spot in the highway where it was a really perfect choke point, we stopped the car, we plugged off one of the lanes with the PC, we left the lights on so that we had some illumination on the road, we took the spike belt and we jumped into the ditch and readied ourselves to put that belt out. So once in the ditch, we actually opened up the case, pulled out the spike belt, and started to open it up. And as you opened it up, it actually got really long. It was almost like an accordion style type of spike belt. And we also knew at this point we were in the perfect location because of the police car and where it was parked and where we were actually on either end of one lane that was going north and south. So this vehicle, as it was coming north, would have to go through this choke point where only one vehicle could fit through. And the spike belt was long enough that it would cover that area. We knew we were going to hit this car. We were completely confident in that moment. The night itself at this point was pitch black. I don't even believe we could see a part of the moon at all. There was no light out whatsoever. And because we were in this mountain valley, it seemed to be even more dark than normal. It was pitch black. We could barely see anything. But we could hear, off in the distance, this faint roar of engines that were screaming up the highway, coming towards us. When we first heard this sound, it was very faint, and we thought that it actually wasn't that far away. But my partner and I stood there for probably good 10 to 15 minutes. And as they etched closer and closer and closer, that sound that was this faint screaming of motors tearing up the mountain eventually turned into a large roar. We were getting updated too at the same time on our radios as to where these Squamish members were. And I think at points they were hitting close to 200 kilometers an hour as they climbed the mountain towards Whistler. My partner and I were growing increasingly impatient, wondering when in fact they were going to cross our bow. It seemed like this was taking forever. But as soon as that impatience really started to settle in, we could start to see some headlights off in the distance. They would crest up over the hill and then drop off again and go back into complete darkness. And then moments later again, they would crest up over a hill and then drop back down, leaving us in complete darkness once more. The roar of the engines were now deafening, and we knew that they were close. The headlights crested up over the last peak of the hill that they were traveling up before they hit a flat section of road where we stood in the ditch. We could see an SUV headed toward us at Mach speeds. I threw that spike belt out as hard as I could across the surface of the road. Now I wanted to throw it out as flat and as close to the surface of the road as possible so that I would just skim across the top and open up and end up laying flat. The last thing I wanted to do was have this thing flip over on its side with no time left to adjust it. To my surprise, that spike belt landed perfectly on the highway. It skidded across, it opened up, it was nice and long, it completely covered off that one lane that was open for that vehicle to travel through as it went by. We had radioed to Squamish members to slow down, that the belt was out, and we needed some space because once that car went over that belt, we needed time to pull it off of the road so we didn't belt those cars. And as they backed off, that suspect continued at 200 kilometers an hour past our point. My buddy and I had retreated from the road now because we had backed away hoping that we needed to stay safe. We didn't want to be up close to the road while that vehicle flew by. We didn't want to get struck by anything, any debris, or if the vehicle had lost control at that point and would come screaming at us. So as we retreated and found even better cover behind some trees, that vehicle drove over the spike belt with such force that it actually picked it up and threw it into the air wildly. That spike belt, as it flipped through the air, was actually attached to a piece of rope, and that rope was exactly what I was holding in the ditch. And at one point, it actually had pulled that rope so tight and pulled my arm outwardly that it almost felt like it was going to snap my arm out of the socket. But once the force of the spike belt had stopped moving forward and pulling me with it, I was able to yank it backwards, back into the ditch, back off the road, so the police cars that were chasing could go by without any incident. So my partner and I now were jumping for joy. We were excited in this moment of the first time in our careers we officially spike belted a car. We were filled with excitement, but we had also forgotten that we needed to join in on the chase, that we couldn't just sit in the ditch and celebrate all night long. Squamish had actually gotten to a point where they had backed right off in fear of hitting that spike belt, so they actually gave quite a bit of room for that vehicle to come through our choke point. And that we needed to actually stop celebrating, jump in our police car, and chase this car down, the same one that we had just spike belted. We had left the spike belt in the ditch, hurried back up the hill onto the road, and I had jumped into the driver's seat with my buddy jumping into the passenger seat. We had floored it and we were back off chasing this vehicle. We didn't see it in that moment, as there was another little crest of the hill that it would have went up over top of, and then we would have lost sight of it, but we knew that it was just beyond that hill somewhere. As our car got up to speed, we quickly caught up and started to close the gap on this SUV. The SUV now at this point was starting to slow. You could tell the tires were flat, and we were now coming down to speeds under 100 kilometers an hour. There was no other vehicles on the road. Everything was completely safe. We actually felt very confident that this was going to end up in a very safe traffic stop. We radioed to dispatch, letting them know that the vehicle was coming close to a stop and that we would be exiting shortly and we would be taking everybody down at gunpoint. Because of the seriousness of this call, that it would possibly have been a stolen vehicle that was just used in a rash of break-and-enters, we weren't going to take any chances. Our guns were coming out, we were going to stop this car, and we were going to get everybody proned out and make sure that no one was going to get hurt, including us. Now, the area itself, Highway 99, on the way to Whistler, there was a mountain range on the left and a deep ditch on the right, 2 lanes going north and south. There was nowhere these guys could run, but as the vehicle came to a stop, the driver of the SUV got out and started to run. So as we stopped that police car with the SUV now just ahead of us, and the driver of the SUV who had gotten out and was now trying to flee on foot, my partner jumped out of the police car, and he was fast. He was a track athlete. So he takes off running, and he instinctively leaves the passenger side of the car, crosses across the hood of the car as he runs in front of the police car, and then starts to pursue the driver of the SUV. My mind goes to who's in the passenger side of that vehicle. So I cross paths with my partner just slightly behind him, and I start to run up towards the passenger side of the vehicle. The passenger door of that SUV kicked open, and a male jumped out of the car and started to flee on foot as well. So I now recognize that I was in a foot pursuit of my own. As I closed the distance and got closer to the passenger door, my mind was playing tricks on me in that moment, and I couldn't register what was going on. I was watching this male, and he was hopping away from the vehicle very slowly on one foot. He didn't stand a chance, and as I drew closer, I recognized I was going to tackle him and take him to the ground, and that's exactly what I did. I bull rushed him, I football tackled him, and I took him straight to the ground. Still perplexed, though, as to why he was hopping, we hit the ground, and he actually broke my fall and skidded across the pavement as we came to a screeching top as I was on his back, and he was now on the surface of the pavement with his hands out in front of him. In shock and complete confusion, I screamed at him, "Why were you hopping away from me? What were you thinking?" And he turned his head and tried to look at me and screamed, "I only have one leg, man." I looked down at his body, and sure enough, he only had one leg, his left leg. His right leg had been amputated just below his hip. So as he tried to hop away, he literally only had one leg. I turned back to him and I said, "What were you going to do? Hop your way to Whistler? We're like 20 kilometers away from Whistler right now." And again, he muttered out, "I don't know, man. I'm just scared as shit right now. I'm just trying to get away." I quickly put that man into cuffs and patted him down, and then quickly realized that I needed to check in on my partner as well. I screamed over to him and I said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I got him. He's fine. We're fine. Everything's good." I said, "Let's clear the car real quick just to make sure nobody else is in the car." My partner and I quickly stood up, guns back out again, and we quickly cleared that car to make sure nobody else was in that car. And there wasn't. We did see a ton of debris inside the car, all most likely stolen items from these individuals as they hit different spots in Squamish, stealing. Squamish RCMP arrived on scene moments later. They thanked us for our work. They grabbed the two individuals that they had been chasing, and they said that they would take care of the rest. My partner and I quickly chatted. We made sure we were both okay, that nobody had gotten hurt. We jumped back in our car. We'd gone back to the spot where we had spike belted this car. We grabbed the spike belt, we put it back together, and we drove back to Whistler. Happy. That was one of the coolest calls I had ever been on in my life. And very rare for a police officer to get the opportunity to actually spike belt a vehicle during a high-speed pursuit. The connections you develop with your partner run deep. While in moments I may not have trusted people, I trusted my partner. He was a good friend, still is a good friend, a good man, a great man, in fact. He stood with me as I got married later on in life. There's nothing I will not do for him, and that bond will never change. There's a very real, rich connection that comes from our brothers and sisters that work in law enforcement. It's unspoken, and it's there. And if you had to ask me what the one thing that I miss most about policing is, it's that connection with people, that deep-rooted connection, that deep trust that you have, knowing that that person is there for you. They will have your back. They will make sure that you are safe, and vice versa. If you still are a first responder, try to pay attention to these connections that you have with your partners and the people that you work with. There may be people in the profession that you do not care for, but you still do have a connection with them. There's a brotherhood, a sisterhood. Always make sure you're watching out for one another. Everyone deserves that. Being there to support each other is the very thing that will challenge this PTSD thing head on. Not letting each other suffer in silence. Following that event, we were met by our watch supervisor who had come back out of bed and met us on the highway. We quickly spoke to him as well. We took a photo. And he thanked us for taking care of this situation. He had complete confidence in us. He was a leader, still is a leader. And we both have great respect for him as well. Despite the pain that comes from policing, you will have many, many evenings, many, many day shifts of amazing calls. Calls where good things happen. Calls that you can celebrate and be thankful for and feel like you made a difference in a positive way. Always remember to celebrate those as well. The career goes by very, very quick, despite at times feeling like it goes by very slowly. I will never forget that night, the night where my buddy and I spike belted our first car, forgot what we had to do next after we had spike belted that car, had chased that car down only to get in a foot chase with a man with one leg. Everyone went home safe that night, even the bad guys. Nobody was hurt. Thanks to the efforts of many law enforcement individuals that night. As always, I thank you for joining me as I share my stories. I hope you have an incredible week. Much love. I hope you enjoyed this last episode. As we continue to grow, I would appreciate your support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Leave a comment or a review and share this with anyone that you may know may benefit from what we are discussing. Have a great week, and as always, thank you for tuning in.